Grief doesn't howl. It sits in the dark and quietly rots the floorboards. King Gareth learned this 10 years ago when his mate bled out on the winter snow, taking his capacity to feel with her. Since then, his reign has been one of cold iron, brutal winters and severed heads. He swore the mating bond was a curse he'd never endure again. Then came a muddy Tuesday during the solstice, a torn cloak, and an Omega who forgot to bow. The armory smelled of linseed oil leather and cold iron. It was the only room in the fortress of Highmont where King Gareth could breathe. He ran a whetstone down the edge of his broadsword. The rhythmic shh of stone on steel was the only sound in the dim chamber. Outside the narrow, slitted windows, the northern wind battered the castle walls, carrying the scent of incoming snow and the distant chaotic noise of 100 arriving carriages. The solstice gathering, a week of feasting drunken brawls and the unbearable stench of desperation. "You're hiding?" Gareth didn't look up. He didn't need to. The scent of pine and old parchment announced his Beta Thomas long before the heavy oak door creaked open. "I am sharpening my blade," Gareth said. His voice was a low rumble, thick with disuse. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words all morning. "You're dulling it," Thomas corrected, stepping into the room. He pulled his fur-lined cloak tighter around his shoulders. The armory had no hearth. Gareth preferred it freezing. The cold kept the beast in his chest lethargic. It kept the memories of blood and dying breaths frozen in the back of his mind. "The lords of the eastern valleys have arrived." Thomas continued, his boots heavy on the stone floor. Lord Harford brought his daughters, 3 of them, all presented as unmated Omegas. Gareth paused. He pressed the flat of the blade against his palm. The metal bit into his calloused skin. "Send them back." "I cannot send them back, Gareth. It is the solstice. They are here to pay taxes and renew their oaths." Thomas sighed, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "And they expect their king to finally take a queen. It has been 10 years. The pack needs an heir. The wolves are growing restless. A king without a mate is a king who lacks an anchor, and an unanchored alpha is a danger to his own people. Let them be restless." Gareth set the whetstone down on the wooden workbench. The thwack was louder than intended. "If Harford or any other lord takes issue with my rule, they can challenge me in the courtyard. I will gladly separate their heads from their shoulders. It would be far less tedious than sitting through another feast smelling their cheap perfumes." Thomas stepped closer. He was the only wolf in Highmont who dared to enter Gareth's striking distance when the king was in a foul mood. "They don't want to fight you. They want to breed with you. You are the Alpha King. Your bloodline is dying. You haven't shifted into your wolf form since the night Beatrice died. You are punishing yourself, and in doing so, you are punishing the pack." Beatrice. The name hung in the freezing air, heavy and jagged. Gareth's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck pulled tight. For a fraction of a second, the phantom smell of copper and wet earth filled his nose. He remembered the ambush, the rogue claws tearing through the perimeter, the way Beatrice had looked at him, her hands pressing desperately against her stomach as the life drained out of her onto the pristine snow. He had roared until his vocal cords tore. He had slaughtered 30 rogues with his bare hands. It hadn't brought her back. "My bloodline ends with me." Gareth said, his tone devoid of any heat. It was a flat, dead statement of fact. "I will name a successor from the generals when the time comes. I will not subject another woman to the target that is the crown, and I will not subject myself to the bond." "The bond isn't a choice, Gareth. If you meet your fated—" "I don't believe in the fates." Gareth interrupted, finally turning to look at his beta. Gareth's eyes were a pale, striking amber, but the light in them had burned out long ago. He looked every bit his 35 years and then some. The harsh lines of his face were framed by unkempt dark hair, threaded with premature silver. A jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, trailing down to his cheekbone. "Tell the kitchen to roast the boars. Tell the musicians to play loud enough to drown out the chatter. I will sit on the dais. I will eat. I will accept their coin. But if any lord pushes an omega into my lap, I will break his hand." Thomas stared at him for a long moment, reading the absolute unyielding stone of his king's posture. He nodded slowly. "As you command. Wear something other than boiled leather tonight. You smell like a mercenary." "I am a mercenary who managed to steal a throne," Gareth muttered, turning back to his sword. When the door clicked shut, Gareth leaned his weight against the workbench. He closed his eyes. Beneath his ribs, his wolf stirred, a restless, chained thing, starved of affection, starved of the wild. It let out a pathetic phantom whine. Gareth pushed the feeling down, burying it under years of practiced ice. He grabbed a rag and began wiping the oil from his blade. 3 floors below the armory in the damp, draughty underbelly of the keep, Nora pushed a bone needle through a thick layer of boiled wool. She grunted softly, wrapping a strip of leather around her thumb to pull the needle tight. The fabric was stiff with old sweat and dried mud. It was a guard's winter cloak, torn in a tavern scuffle 2 nights prior. "If you pull any harder, you'll snap the thread, and I'm not giving you another spool until tomorrow." Greta snapped from across the mending room. The head seamstress was a bitter beta woman with a face like a dried apple and a temper to match. "It's thick," Nora said, simply not looking up. Winter winds don't care about delicate stitching. Nora was 24. In the hierarchy of the werewolf packs, an omega of her age was either nursing her 3rd child or serving as a high-ranking lord's favoured companion. Nora was neither. She was by all accounts invisible. She didn't have the delicate porcelain features prized in omegas. Her hair was a mousy, ordinary brown, currently tied back in a messy knot that kept slipping down her neck. Her hands were rough, calloused from years of needlework scrubbing floors and hauling firewood. She wore a faded grey linen dress that hung loosely on her frame. She was the daughter of a foot soldier who died in a forgotten skirmish, and a mother who died of a winter fever when Nora was 12. She had no dowry, no patron, and no pack standing. She was a ghost in the machine of Highmont. And that was exactly how she liked it. "The High Lords are here," whispered Clara, a young, wide-eyed omega sitting on the bench next to Nora. Clara was darning a sock, but her attention was fixed on the tiny window near the ceiling that looked out onto the muddy courtyard. "I saw Lord Harford's carriage. It was painted gold. Do you think the king will pick one of his daughters?" "I think the king would rather swallow glass," Nora murmured, biting off the end of her thread. She smoothed the mended tear on the cloak. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. "Don't speak treason, Nora." Greta barked, though she was busy inspecting a pile of silken banners. "It's not treason, it's observation," Nora replied, her voice even. "I mend his hunting tunics. The man hasn't worn a ceremonial robe in 5 years. He smells of iron and anger. He isn't looking for a bride. Well, he needs one." Clara sighed wistfully. "It's so romantic, isn't it? A tragic king mourning his lost love, waiting for the right woman to thaw his frozen heart." Nora snorted. It was a deeply unladylike sound. She picked up the next item in her pile, a heavily embroidered tunic belonging to one of the visiting lords. It smelled aggressively of musk oil and sour wine. "There's nothing romantic about freezing to death, Clara. The king isn't frozen, he's just tired. Grief makes people tired. Now hand me the black thread this peacock managed to rip his sleeve clean off the shoulder." The door to the mending room banged open. A breathless scullery boy leaned in. "Greta the steward needs 3 girls in the great hall. The lords are spilling wine faster than the pages can wipe it up, and one of Harford's hounds got loose and tore down a tapestry. It's a mess." Greta scowled, her eyes darting around the room. They landed on Nora. "You, Clara, Bess, get upstairs. Bring the heavy lye soap and the bristle brushes. Don't look at anyone, don't speak to anyone. Clean the mess and come straight back." Nora sighed, setting the embroidered tunic down. Her lower back ached a dull throb that had been with her since she woke at dawn. She stood up, brushing lint from her skirt. She didn't mind the great hall so long as she could stay in the shadows. The heat of the massive hearths would be a welcome change from the cellar's dampness. She walked to the supply closet, her left leg dragging just a fraction of an inch, a lasting souvenir from a badly set bone when she fell from a wagon as a child. It wasn't a severe limp, but enough to ruin any grace she might have possessed. Grabbing a wooden bucket and a block of harsh lye soap, she followed the younger girls out the door. She smelled like crushed rosemary, which she used to keep the moths away from the wool, and the sharp, clean scent of lye. "Keep your head down, Clara," Nora warned quietly as they climbed the spiraling stone steps toward the noise of the feast. The visiting alphas drink heavily on the solstice. Don't mistake a drunk man's leer for a romantic proposition. Clara deflated a little, but nodded. Nora pushed open the heavy servant's door, and the roar of the great hall washed over them. The great hall was a suffocating inferno of noise, heat, and competing scents. Gareth sat in the high-backed wooden throne at the center of the dais, his knuckles white where he gripped the carved armrests. Hundreds of candles cast flickering, erratic shadows against the stone walls, making the mounted tapestries look like moving corpses. Below him, the long wooden tables were crowded with the elite of his kingdom. They tore into roasted meats, slammed heavy iron tankards onto the wood, and laughed with their throats exposed. It was a display of power, wealth, and profound ignorance. To Gareth's heightened senses, it was a nightmare. The air was thick with the cloying perfumes of the presented omegas, jasmine, heavy rose, sweet vanilla. It mixed with the sharp, aggressive musk of the alphas, puffing out their chests trying to impress him. It made his stomach turn. He took a sip of his ale. It tasted like bitter ash. "Lord Harford is approaching," Thomas murmured from Gareth's right. Gareth tracked the man. Harford was a portly alpha, his velvet tunic straining against his belly. Behind him trailed 3 young women, heads bowed, perfectly dressed in silks that were entirely inappropriate for the mountain winter. "My king!" Harford boomed, bowing low. The music in the hall seemed to quiet just enough for everyone to listen. "We bring you the warmth of the eastern valleys, and I present my daughters, Lady Cecily, Lady Rosalind, and Lady Margot." The 3 women curtsied. They were flawless, beautiful young submissive. They smelled of terror and expensive oils. Gareth stared at them. He felt absolutely nothing. No spark, no interest, not even a glimmer of basic desire. His wolf remained curled in a tight, dead ball in his chest. "Thank you, Lord Harford," Gareth said. His voice easily cut through the hall, cold and sharp as a battle-axe. "Your tribute is noted. The eastern valleys have always been loyal. Go, drink, eat." Harford blinked, his smile faltering. "Sire, I hoped... The girls have practiced a dance." I said. Gareth leaned forward, the shadows catching the harsh angles of his scarred face. "Eat." Harford swallowed hard, the scent of his fear spiking. He bowed quickly and ushered his daughters away. A tense murmur rippled through the hall. Gareth abruptly stood up. His chair scraped violently against the stone floor. "Gareth," Thomas warned under his breath, "I need air. Handle them." Gareth ordered. Without waiting for a reply, he stepped off the back of the dais, slipping through a heavy velvet curtain that led to the servant corridors. The immediate quiet of the hallway was a physical relief. The air here was cooler, devoid of the suffocating perfumes. He walked blindly, his boots echoing on the flagstones, just needing to put distance between himself and the oppressive expectations of his crown. He didn't know where he was going. He just walked until the noise of the great hall was nothing but a dull hum. He found himself near the eastern archway that led to the kitchen courtyards. The heavy wooden door was propped open, letting in the biting, freezing night air. Gareth stopped. He leaned his shoulder against the cold stone wall, closing his eyes, dragging the crisp, icy air into his lungs. Then he heard a sound, a quiet, raspy chuckle. He opened his eyes and looked toward the courtyard. The ground was a mess of frozen mud and patchy snow. Sitting on an overturned wooden crate near the kitchen stairs was a woman. She was out of the wind, hunched over a large, three-legged wolfhound that belonged to the castle's hunting pack. The hound Old Barnaby was notoriously mean. He had bitten 2 squires this month alone. But right now, the massive beast had his head resting heavily in the woman's lap, his tail thumping rhythmically against the dirt. Gareth stayed perfectly still, cloaked in the shadows of the archway. The woman was entirely unremarkable. She wore a drab grey dress, her brown hair falling out of a messy bun. She held a large bristle brush in one hand, but she had paused her work to scratch the hound behind his tattered ear. "You're a miserable old brute, aren't you?" the woman murmured to the dog. Her voice wasn't musical. It was grounded, slightly husky, tired. "Just like the rest of the men in this castle, all teeth and no manners." The dog let out a contented groan. Yes, I know," she said, pulling a scrap of roasted meat from her apron pocket and feeding it to him. "You just want a warm fire and a quiet corner. Me too, Barnaby, me too." She looked up, then staring out at the falling snow. And she smiled. It wasn't a smile meant for a king. It wasn't practiced in a mirror. It didn't reach for approval or beg for attention. It was just a small, private expression of genuine, exhausted contentment. It crinkled the corners of her eyes and softened the plain lines of her face. In the shadows, Gareth's breath hitched. A scent hit him. It had been there all along, but the freezing wind suddenly carried it directly to him. Lye soap, damp wool, crushed rosemary. And beneath it all, the rich, earthy scent of rain on dry soil. Inside Gareth's chest, the dead thing twitched. His heart gave a singular, massive thud that echoed in his ears. His knuckles, previously relaxed, clenched. The wolf, dormant, grieving, chained for 10 years, lifted its head and opened its eyes. Mine. The instinct was so sudden, so violently undeniable, that Gareth actually took a physical step back, his boot scraping against a loose stone. The noise was quiet, but in the still night it snapped like a twig. The woman's head snapped toward the archway. The smile vanished instantly, replaced by the guarded blank mask of a castle servant. She stood up quickly, wincing slightly, as she put weight on her left leg and smoothed her apron. She couldn't see his face in the dark, only the massive silhouette of a tall man standing in the doorway. "I apologize, my lord." She said, her tone perfectly flat, devoid of the warmth she had just shown the dog. "I was just taking a breath. The tapestry in the hall is cleaned. I am returning to the mending rooms now." Gareth stepped forward out of the shadows and into the pale moonlight filtering into the courtyard. The silver light caught the scar on his face, the heavy rings on his fingers, and the unmistakable, terrifying gold of his eyes. Nora froze. The breath left her lungs in a visible white puff. She didn't bow. She was too paralyzed by the sudden, suffocating proximity of the Alpha King. Gareth looked down at her. She was small, coming only to his chest. She smelled like work and exhaustion. She wasn't trembling, though her heart was beating a frantic rhythm he could hear perfectly. She met his gaze, her dark eyes wide, but surprisingly steady. He had spent a decade convinced he would never feel the pull again. He had built an empire of ice to ensure it. Yet here it was, brought down by a ripped cloak and a tired woman feeding a 3-legged dog. Gareth stared at her, his chest rising and falling heavily. He didn't know how to speak to her. He didn't know how to speak to anyone without giving a command. "What?" Gareth rasped, his voice rougher than coarse grit. "Is your name?" Nora swallowed hard. "Nora, sire." Gareth tasted the name on his tongue. Nora. He didn't order her back to work. He didn't turn away. He just stood there in the freezing mud, staring at the forgotten Omega while the ice around his heart began violently to crack. The silence stretched thin and brittle like ice over a frozen pond. Nora waited for the dismissal. It was how interactions with the nobility always ended: a flick of the wrist, a turned back, an order to vanish. But King Gareth did not move. He stood planted in the slush of the courtyard, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, heavy rhythm that seemed completely at odds with the freezing air. He was staring at her. It wasn't the predatory leer of the drunken guards, nor the dismissive glare of the head seamstress. It was a look of intense, almost violent calculation. "The mending rooms?" Gareth repeated. The word sounded foreign in his mouth. "Yes, sire." Nora said, her voice tight. She kept her chin tucked, avoiding his gaze now. The instinct to flee was screaming in her ears, louder than the wind. "I must return. Greta will dock my rations if I tarry." Gareth's jaw shifted. A muscle ticked beneath the jagged scar on his cheek. He took a single step closer. The sheer mass of him blocked out the pale light spilling from the kitchens. "You will not return to the mending rooms?" Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Nora's chest. She clutched the bristle brush tighter, her knuckles turning white. To be noticed by a king was dangerous. To be singled out was a death sentence for a low-born Omega. The court was a viper's nest. They destroyed anything out of place. "Please, my king." Nora whispered the words, tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I have done nothing wrong. I cleaned the tapestry. I only sat to rest my leg. I beg your forgiveness." Gareth frowned. The expression made him look terrifying, shadowing his amber eyes in the hollows of his brow. He didn't want her apologies. He wanted to wrap her in his cloak and lock her in the highest tower where the scent of other men could never touch her. The feral possessive urge of the wolf clawed at the back of his mind. He forced it down. He had to be careful. He could crush her without meaning to. "You have done nothing requiring forgiveness?" Gareth said, his tone deliberately flattened. He looked over his shoulder. "Thomas." The baiter emerged from the shadows of the corridor a moment later, his face drawn tight with concern. He had clearly been watching. He glanced from the king to the plain, shivering girl by the crate, his nose twitching slightly. Thomas froze. He caught the scent. The sudden, overwhelming surge of his alpha's possessive pheromones. Thomas's eyes widened in profound shock. "My king." Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. "This woman is reassigned," Gareth stated. He didn't look away from Nora. "She is no longer a cellar servant. She will take over the duties of my personal chambers, wardrobe, hearth, and mending." Nora's stomach plummeted. "Sire, I am not trained." "She will be moved to the antechamber at the end of the western hall." Gareth talked over her, addressing his baiter. "Tonight. See it done." Thomas cleared his throat. "Gareth, the western hall is reserved for high officers and concubines." A low growl vibrated in the back of Gareth's throat, a sound so inhuman that old Barnaby the three-legged hound whimpered and scrambled backward into the dirt. "She is neither—" Gareth snapped the gold in his eyes, flaring dangerously. "She is my personal servant. Anyone who implies otherwise or speaks ill of her presence will answer to my blade. Is that understood, baiter?" Thomas bowed his head, showing his neck in immediate submission to the heavy alpha command. "Perfectly, sire." Gareth turned his gaze back to Nora. She looked terrified. Her small frame was rigid, her breathing shallow. He had done that. He had terrified her. A heavy knot of self-loathing twisted in his gut. He didn't know how to be gentle. 10 years of war and isolation had burned the softness out of him. Without another word, Gareth turned on his heel and strode back into the castle. He left the scent of sharp winter and ozone in his wake. Nora stood, frozen, the harsh lye soap burning the cracked skin of her hands. "Come along, girl," Thomas said softly, walking over to her. He didn't look at her with malice, but with a deep, weary pity. "Gather your things. The king has spoken." Nora looked at the massive stone keep looming above them. It no longer looked like a place of employment. It looked like a cage. The antechamber in the western hall was a world away from the damp cellar. It was small, but it had a heavy woolen rug over the stone floor, a thick feather mattress, and a hearth that someone had already stocked with dry birch. Nora sat on the edge of the bed, her single canvas bag of belongings resting by her feet. She had been here for 3 days. For 3 days the court had whispered. She felt their eyes whenever she walked to the kitchens to fetch the king's meals. The haughty glares from Lord Hertford's daughters. The venomous scowl from Greta, who had been forced to hand over Nora's meagre contract to the royal steward. They thought she was the king's new whore, a dirty, low-born distraction. But for 3 days Gareth hadn't spoken a word to her. He allowed her into his chambers to stoke his fire, to lay out his tunics, and to clear his plates. He was always there, sitting at his heavy oak desk, reading reports or polishing his weapons. He never looked at her. But Nora felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his attention. It was a physical pressure in the room. He tracked her movements entirely by scent and sound. On the 4th morning it snowed heavily, trapping the visiting lords indoors. The tension in the keep was palpable. Nora entered Gareth's private quarters carrying a basket of folded linens and a leather-bound measuring string. The steward had ordered a new, formal cloak to be tailored for the king before the solstice feast ended, and he had rudely shoved the task onto Nora. Gareth was standing by the window staring out at the whiteout conditions. He wore a simple linen shirt and dark trousers. He looked massive, unmovable, and exhausted. "Put the linens in the chest," Gareth said, without turning around. His voice was a low rumble. Nora obeyed her hands, moving quickly, efficiently. She closed the heavy oak lid. She hesitated. She could leave. She should leave. But the steward would have her whipped if the measurements weren't turned into the royal tailor by noon. "Sire," Nora said softly. Gareth stiffened. He turned his head slightly. "What? The steward requires measurements for your solstice cloak." She held up the leather string. Her hands were shaking slightly. She hated that they were shaking. Gareth turned fully to face her. The pale light from the window washed over the harsh angles of his face. He stared at the leather string, then at her face. For a long moment he didn't move. Then slowly he stepped away from the window and walked toward the center of the room. He raised his arms horizontally. Nora swallowed hard. She stepped forward. She was barely tall enough to reach his shoulders. The proximity was overwhelming. Up close, he didn't smell like a terrifying monarch. He smelled like clean, sweat-cold pine and old grief. She brought the string across his broad shoulders. Her knuckles accidentally brushed the warm, hard muscle of his back through the thin linen. Gareth drew in a sharp breath. His muscles locked into stone. "Sorry," Nora whispered instinctively, dropping her hands. "Don't apologize." Gareth said, his voice tighter than she had ever heard it. "Just finish it." Nora nodded, stepping closer again. She had to measure his chest. She brought the string around him, leaning in slightly. To do so, she had to step into his personal space, her face mere inches from his throat. She could hear his heart. Thud, thud, thud. It was racing. The Alpha King, the man who had slaughtered armies without breaking a sweat, had a heart that was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Nora paused. She looked up. Gareth was looking down at her. His amber eyes were wide, the pupils blown almost completely black. The sheer intensity of his stare pinned her to the floorboards. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the unsaid, crushing weight of the bond he was fighting to suppress. Why is he looking at me like I am the only thing keeping him from drowning? Nora thought her own breath catching in her throat. "Your arm." Nora managed to say, her voice barely a scrape of sound. "I need you to hold it straight." Gareth blinked, as if dragging himself out of a deep water. He slowly lowered his right arm, holding it rigid. Nora measured his sleeve length, noting the knot on the string. She stepped back instantly, wrapping the leather cord around her palm. "That is all, sire. I will take these to the tailor." She turned and practically fled toward the heavy oak door. "Nora." She stopped her hand on the iron ring. She didn't turn around. "I do not care what the court whispers," Gareth said to her back. The authority was back in his voice, but there was a crack in the foundation. "You are safe here. No one will touch you. You have my word." Nora closed her eyes. The promise of a king. It was a heavy, dangerous thing to carry. "Thank you, sire," she said softly and slipped out the door. Behind her, Gareth braced both his hands on his heavy wooden desk, bowing his head. His chest heaved. He had wanted to touch her. He had wanted to press his face into her messy brown hair and breathe in the scent of rosemary until the memories of blood finally stopped screaming in his head. He hit the desk with a closed fist. The heavy oak cracked straight down the middle. The solstice hunt was not a sport. It was a brutal political theatre. It took place on the 6th day of the gathering, deep in the frozen pine forests of the lower valley. The snow was knee-deep. The visiting alphas and their retinues rode massive, thick-coated war horses, dressed in boiled leather and heavy furs carrying iron-tipped spears. Gareth rode at the front on a towering black gelding. He hated the hunt. He hated the pageantry of killing for sport rather than sustenance or defense. But tradition dictated the king must lead, and Gareth could not show weakness in front of lords who were already looking for an excuse to challenge his airless reign. Nora stood on the battlements of the lower bailey, wrapped in a thick wool cloak that Beta Thomas had personally shoved into her hands that morning. She watched the hunting party disappear into the tree line. The air was frigid, biting at her nose and cheeks. "Hoping he falls off his horse, are we—" Nora didn't flinch. She turned to see Lady Cecily, the eldest of Lord Hertford's daughters, standing a few feet away, flanked by 2 giggling handmaidens. Cecily wore a fur-lined velvet cloak that belonged in a southern parlour, not on a northern fortress wall. "I am hoping the king returned safely, my lady," Nora said neutrally, keeping her eyes lowered. Cecily scoffed, stepping closer. "Don't play coy with me, cellar rat. I know what you are. A warm body to keep his bed until he chooses a proper queen. Enjoy the silk sheets while they last. When my father secures the marriage contract, I will have you whipped and thrown back to the gutters." Nora looked up. She met Cecily's perfectly symmetrical, cruel face. "The king does not sleep in silk sheets," Nora said, her voice eerily calm. "He sleeps on wool. He drinks bitter ale, he hates the smell of jasmine, and he sharpens his own swords because he trusts no one else to do it. You don't want the king, my lady. You want a crown, and those are 2 very different things." Cecily's face flushed a violent, ugly red. She raised a gloved hand to strike Nora. A heavy, booming horn echoed from the distant tree line, cutting through the freezing air. Cecily lowered her hand, startled. The giggling handmaidens fell silent. The sound was not the triumphant blast of a successful kill. It was the frantic, jagged call of a hunting party in distress. Down in the forest, chaos had erupted. It was supposed to be a penned stag. Instead, a massive, scarred dire boar had been driven from the deep caves. The beast was the size of a small wagon, bristling with coarse black hair and tusks thick as tree trunks. It was blind in one eye and mad with pain from a poorly aimed spear thrown by one of Hertford's men. The boar charged the horses. 2 steeds went down, screaming, their bellies torn open. Lords scrambled into the snow, dropping their weapons in sheer terror. "Hold the line!" Gareth roared, reining in his panicking gelding. He drove his spear downward, catching the boar in the thick gristle of its shoulder. The wood snapped like a twig. The boar shrieked a deafening sound and whirled. It charged straight at Lord Hertford, who had fallen into a snowdrift trapped under his dead horse. Hertford screamed, holding up his hands. Gareth didn't think. The human part of his brain, the part that hated Harford, the part that calculated political gain, shut off entirely. The pack was threatened. Gareth vaulted from his horse. He hit the snow boots first. As he lunged toward the charging beast, the heavy leather of his armor ripped. His bones cracked, snapping and reforming with a sickening wet crunch. Muscle tore and expanded, clothes shredded into bloody ribbons. He hadn't shifted in 10 years. The pain was agonizing, blinding, but the beast inside him welcomed it with a triumphant, roaring bloodlust. By the time Gareth intercepted the boar, the man was gone. In his place stood a monster. A wolf the size of a warhorse covered in coarse, pitch-black fur. Its eyes burned like twin suns against the stark white snow. The wolf didn't use a spear. It slammed into the boar like a battering ram, a collision of muscle and bone that shook the ground. The boar squealed, trying to gore the wolf's underbelly, but the alpha was too fast, too violently strong. Gareth's jaws, lined with teeth like daggers, clamped down on the thick, corded neck of the boar. He didn't let go. He crushed the spine. The snap echoed through the silent, frozen forest. The boar slumped to the ground, dead. Gareth stood over the massive carcass, his chest heaving, his muzzle painted in hot blood. The steam rose from his body in thick white clouds. He let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in the chests of every man present. The visiting alphas, the arrogant lords, the bravest knights, they all fell to their knees in the bloody snow. They exposed their throats. They pressed their foreheads to the dirt. They were terrified. They realized with profound horror that they had spent a week mocking a god of death. Up on the battlements, Nora gripped the stone wall. The distance was far, but her eyesight tracked the massive black shadow standing amidst the kneeling men. Cecily was whimpering, covering her face. "A monster! He's a monster!" Nora didn't look away. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the blood on the snow. She saw the sheer, terrifying power of the Alpha King. But she also saw the way the giant black wolf stood perfectly still, turning its massive head not toward the men cowering at its feet, but up, toward the castle, toward the wall. Even from a mile away, Nora felt the impact of those glowing amber eyes pinning her in place. The wolf wasn't gloating. It was looking for an anchor. It was looking for her. "He's not a monster," Nora whispered to the wind, her fingers digging into the frost-covered stone. "He's just bleeding." The hunting party did not return with horns blowing or banners waving. They returned in a suffocating, terrified silence as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of Highmont, casting the fortress in heavy, bruised twilight. They marched into the main courtyard, horses tossing their heads, their hooves slipping on the blood-spotted snow. At the center of the procession walked the king. He had not shifted back. The massive black wolf paced the cobblestones, its shoulders rolling with coiled, violent tension. It was an unnatural sight. Alpha wolves were larger than average, yes, but Gareth's beast was a nightmare, pulled from the ancient savage days of the first packs. He stood taller than a destrier, his fur matted with dried boar blood, his jaws half open to reveal teeth that could snap an anvil. He was pacing a tight circle near the armory doors, snapping at the air, growling at the shadows. "Keep the men back." Thomas ordered, his voice strained. The beta stood at the edge of the courtyard, clutching his left forearm. Blood soaked through his heavy woolen sleeve. He had tried to approach the king. The king had nearly torn his arm off. "He's trapped," muttered Lord Harford, standing safely behind a phalanx of his own terrified guards. "It's been 10 years. The beast has gone feral. He doesn't recognize his own pack. He needs to be put down before he breaches the inner keep." Thomas turned, his eyes flashing with a sudden lethal rage. He drew his broadsword with his good arm, resting the tip against the cobblestones inches from Harford's expensive boots. "Speak another word of treason, Harford, and I will feed you to him myself. He saved your pathetic life today." Half had swallowed hard and backed away, but the fear in the courtyard was a tangible, rotting smell. The wolf snapped its jaws, a sound like a steel trap closing, and let out a broken, agonizing howl. It wasn't a roar of victory. It was a scream of pure, undiluted grief. Thomas closed his eyes. He knew what was happening. The last time Gareth had worn this skin, he had been standing over Beatrice's mutilated body. The wolf's mind was submerged in a decade-old nightmare. It didn't see the safety of the castle walls. It only saw the snow, the blood, and the ghosts of the rogues that had destroyed its life. "Fetch the chains," a guard captain whispered, terrified. "Beta Thomas, we have to chain him. Iron won't hold him." Thomas rasped. He looked up, his eyes scanning the narrow, flickering windows of the servant corridors. He remembered the scent in the western hall. He remembered the shattered oak desk in the king's study. "Don't fetch chains," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Fetch the Omega." Nora was already running down the spiraling stone stairs. She had seen the procession from the upper bailey. She had heard that terrible broken sound echo off the mountain walls. Her left leg ached violently with every hurried step, but she didn't stop. She pushed past the panicked guards barricading the heavy oak doors, shoving her way into the freezing air of the courtyard. "Stop her!" someone yelled. Nora ignored them. She stepped off the stone stairs and into the slush. The courtyard fell dead silent. 100 armed men watched in paralyzed horror as the plain, mousy servant girl in a faded grey dress walked toward the towering monster that had just slaughtered a dire boar with its bare teeth. The wolf froze. Its massive head snapped toward her. The amber eyes were blown wide, glowing with a frenzied, mindless panic. A low, vibrating growl started deep in its massive chest, rattling the loose stones on the ground. The beast lowered its head, flattening its ears. It didn't recognize her. It only saw an approach, a threat. "Nora, stop!" Thomas barked, taking a step forward. "He isn't in his right mind. He will kill you." Nora didn't look at the beta. She kept her eyes fixed on the glowing amber irises of the wolf. Her heart was beating so hard it bruised her ribs. Every survival instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run, to hide, to drop to the mud and expose her neck. She didn't. She kept walking. She stopped 3 feet away from the snarling jaws. She could feel the heat radiating off his massive body. She could smell the iron of the blood, the ozone of the shift, and beneath it the desperate, suffocating terror of a creature trapped in its own mind. "Gareth," Nora said. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't a command. It was just a calm, grounded sound in a courtyard full of panic. The wolf flinched. The growl hitched in its throat. "You are in the courtyard." Nora continued, keeping her tone flat, steady, like she was talking to old Barnaby the Hound. She didn't reach her hand out. She didn't make sudden movements. She just stood there, smelling of crushed rosemary lye soap and damp wool. "It is the solstice. The snow is dirty. The air is cold. You are alive. You are here." The wolf took a heavy, staggering step forward. The massive head lowered until its blood-stained muzzle was inches from her face. The heat of its breath washed over her cheeks. Nora held her ground. She didn't close her eyes. She looked directly into the swirling gold of his irises. "Stop fighting ghosts!" Nora whispered, the cynical edge of her voice softening into something brutally honest. "They're already dead. I am here. Come back." Slowly, deliberately, Nora raised her rough, calloused hand. She didn't pet him. She pressed her palm flat against the thick, coarse fur of his massive cheek. The physical contact was like a lightning strike. The wolf gasped, a painfully human sound. The frantic, feral light in its eyes shattered. The beast closed its eyes, leaning its massive, crushing weight into her small hand. A shudder ripped through the giant black body. Then the bones began to break. The shift back was just as violent as the transformation. Nora didn't look away, though the sound of snapping cartilage and tearing muscle made her stomach churn. The massive beast shrank, contorted, and collapsed. A moment later, Gareth lay in the freezing mud at her feet. He was entirely naked, covered in a terrifying mixture of freezing mud, sweat, and drying blood. He was violently trembling, his skin pale, his chest heaving as he gasped for the freezing air. 10 years of suppressed shifting had taken a devastating physical toll on his human body. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck. Thomas rushed forward with a heavy fur cloak, throwing it over the king's broad shoulders. Gareth didn't acknowledge his beta. He pushed up onto his hands and knees, his breath tearing through his throat in jagged, painful gasps. He looked up. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. His amber eyes were entirely human, now filled with exhaustion, pain, and a desperate, clinging clarity. He reached out, his large, blood-stained hand wrapped around Nora's wrist. His grip was weak, shaking, but absolutely unyielding. "Don't leave!" Gareth rasped, his voice barely a torn whisper. Nora looked down at the Alpha King, the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, shivering in the mud and clinging to her like a lifeline. "I'm not going anywhere," Nora said. The fire in the royal bedchamber roared, eating through the heavy birch logs with a violent crackle. The heat in the room was stifling, but Gareth still shivered. He sat on the edge of his massive 4-poster bed, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. His skin was bruised a deep, mottled purple across his ribs and shoulders, the physical echo of the shift. A silver basin of warm water sat on a stool nearby. Nora knelt on the floor beside him, wringing out a linen cloth. She carefully wiped the remaining dried blood from his forearms. The room was painfully quiet. The heavy oak doors were bolted shut from the inside. Outside in the corridors, the castle was in an uproar. The visiting lords were demanding an emergency council. The guards were pacing the halls. The delicate political structure of Highmont was fracturing in real time. Neither Gareth nor Nora cared. "You shouldn't be on the floor," Gareth said. His voice was rough, scraping against the silence. Nora didn't look up. She rinsed the cloth in the basin. The water turned a pale, rusty pink. "It's easier to reach your arms from here, and I've spent my entire life on the floor, sire. It doesn't bother me." "Stop calling me that." Nora paused. She looked up at him. The harsh lines of his face were softened by exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. They were watching her with that same intense, suffocating focus he had shown in the courtyard. "It is your title," she pointed out quietly. "Not to you," Gareth replied. He leaned forward, ignoring the groan of his bruised ribs. He reached out and gently took the bloody cloth from her hands, tossing it onto the floor. Then he wrapped his large, warm hands around hers. Her hands were small red from the lye soap covered in tiny scars from needle pricks and hauling firewood. They were the hands of a labourer. He held them like they were the most precious things in the keep. "I nearly killed Thomas today," Gareth said, his voice dropping to a low, raw pitch. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what year it was. I was entirely gone." He swallowed his Adam's apple bobbing. "But I knew your scent, even in the dark, even in the blood. I knew it was you." Nora's chest tightened. She tried to pull her hands away, a sudden surge of defensive panic rising in her throat, but his grip, though gentle, was immovable. "Don't?" Nora whispered, looking away, staring at the flickering shadows on the rug. "Don't say these things. You are confused." "The shift trauma. I am not confused." Gareth interrupted his tone, hardening into absolute certainty. "I am 35 years old. I have fought in 4 wars. I have buried a mate. I know what the bond is, Nora, and I know what it isn't." He squeezed her hands, forcing her to look at him. "It isn't magic," Gareth said, his amber eyes burning into hers. It doesn't fix anything. It didn't bring Beatrice back. It didn't stop the nightmares. I hated the Fates for 10 years because I thought they cursed me with a biological imperative I couldn't escape. He took a slow, painful breath. But you are not an imperative. You did not look at my crown. You did not look at my power. You looked at a broken, bleeding monster in the mud, and you told it to stop fighting ghosts. You anchor me, not because of a scent, because of you. Nora felt a tear, hot and sharp, prick the corner of her eye. She blinked it away violently. She was a cynical, invisible Omega. She did not believe in fairy tales. She believed in cold winters and hard work. I am a nobody. Nora said, her voice shaking slightly, betraying her. I have a limp. I have no dowry. If you claim me, the lords will revolt. Lord Harford is out there right now, plotting to use your feral state to force a regent on the throne. If you take a low-born Omega, they will say you are insane. Let them. Gareth rumbled. A dark, terrifying smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. I have been looking for an excuse to purge the Eastern Lords for 5 years. If they want to question my sanity, they can do it to my face. A heavy, frantic knocking echoed from the heavy oak doors. Gareth. Thomas's voice was muffled through the thick wood. Gareth, you need to open the door. Harford has rallied the other alphas in the Great Hall. They are drafting a petition of instability. They demand you step down or take Lady Cecily as your mate immediately to secure a rational bloodline. Gareth let go of Nora's hands. The vulnerability vanished from his face, replaced instantly by the cold, brutal mask of the Alpha King. He stood up. He didn't stumble. The pain in his ribs seemed to evaporate, fueled by a sudden icy rage. He walked to the heavy wooden wardrobe. He didn't pull out the ceremonial silks or the velvet tunics. He pulled out his battle leathers. The dark, boiled leather armor scored with old blade marks. Help me strap this! Gareth ordered, his voice returning to the booming, unquestionable gravel of command. Nora stood up. She didn't hesitate. She moved behind him, pulling the heavy leather straps tight through the iron buckles. Her fingers were deft, practiced. She pulled them tight enough to brace his bruised ribs. They have 50 armed men in their retinues. Nora stated quietly, as she buckled the last strap across his chest. You are injured. Gareth turned around. He looked down at her, his eyes devoid of the feral panic replaced by absolute, calculated, lethal intent. They are politicians. I am a butcher. There is a difference. He grabbed his broadsword from the table, sliding it into the scabbard on his back. He walked to the door and threw the heavy iron bolt. Thomas stood in the corridor, looking panicked, his arm heavily bandaged. Behind him stood 6 of the king's elite guard, their hands resting uneasily on the pommels of their swords. Tell the lords I will not meet them in the Great Hall, Gareth said, stepping into the corridor. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of his alpha aura flooded the stone hallway, causing the elite guards to instinctively lower their heads. Tell them to meet me in the courtyard, in the snow, where they knelt to me 3 hours ago. Gareth, this is political suicide, Thomas urged, keeping his voice low. No, Thomas. It is a cleansing. Gareth looked back into the room. Nora, come. Nora stepped out of the bedchamber. She still wore her faded grey dress. It was stained with mud and his blood. She looked entirely out of place among the armoured men and the ancient stone of the keep. But as she walked to stand slightly behind Gareth's right shoulder, she didn't look down. She kept her chin level. Gareth looked at her, and a small, almost imperceptible fraction of the ice in his eyes thawed. He turned back to Thomas. Bring them, Gareth commanded. He began the long walk down the corridor, his boots echoing like war drums against the stone. The courtyard was freezing, illuminated by the harsh, flickering orange light of a dozen iron braziers. The snow was still stained with the blood of the afternoon's terror. Lord Harford and 4 other high-ranking alphas stood in a cluster near the gates. They were dressed in heavy furs, surrounded by their personal guards. They looked emboldened, whispering among themselves, confident that a king who lost his mind to a beast could be easily manipulated. Until the heavy oak doors opened, Gareth stepped out into the biting wind. He didn't wear a crown. He didn't wear a heavy fur cloak. He wore his scarred battle armor, his broadsword strapped to his back. His face was a mask of carved granite. The whispering stopped instantly. Behind the king walked Beta Thomas, and beside Thomas the plain, blood-stained Omega servant girl. Harford frowned, stepping forward. He puffed his chest out, trying to project his own alpha pheromones, though they felt pathetic against the crushing weight of the king's presence. "King Gareth." Harford began, his voice echoing in the cold air. "We are relieved to see you. Recovered. However, the events of today have forced our hand. The pack is terrified. A king who cannot control his shift is a danger to us all. We have drafted a petition." "Burn it," Gareth interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute, terrifying authority. Harford blinked. "Sire, the law dictates that I am the Alpha King, won by right of combat, held by right of blood." Gareth stepped down the stairs, moving into the center of the courtyard. He stopped exactly where he had fallen in the mud earlier. "You want stability, Harford. You want a guarantee that my beast will not tear through your estates. We demand you take a high-born mate," a lord from the western ridges called out, stepping beside Harford. "Lady Cecily is presented. The bond will ground your feral nature." Gareth let out a short, harsh laugh. The sound was devoid of humor. It made the hair on the back of Nora's neck stand up. "A high-born mate." Gareth mused, pacing slowly in a half-circle, moving like the wolf he had just shed. "A woman who wears silk in the winter and faints at the smell of blood. You think a pampered child will ground a monster?" Gareth stopped. He turned and looked directly at Nora. He didn't gesture for her to come to him. He didn't issue a command. He simply held out his hand. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Nora felt the eyes of 100 armed men on her. She felt the venomous glare of Lord Harford. She felt the oppressive, crushing weight of the kingdom's hierarchy. But looking at Gareth's outstretched hand, she saw none of it. She saw the man who had trembled on the floor. She saw the man who sharpened his own swords because he trusted no one to protect him. Nora stepped forward. Her left leg dragged slightly in the slush. She walked past the furious High Lords, past the elite guards, and stepped into the center of the courtyard. She placed her calloused, lie-burned hand into the massive, scarred palm of the Alpha King. Gareth pulled her close. He didn't hide her behind him. He pulled her to stand flush at his side, presenting a united front. "This is Nora." Gareth said, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. "She mends the cloaks your soldiers tear. She scrubs the floors your boots dirty. And when you were all weeping on your knees in the forest, terrified of a dying boar, she walked into the jaws of a feral beast and brought me back." Harford's face turned a violent shade of purple. "This is an outrage. She is a low-born cellar rat, an unmarked Omega with no standing. You cannot mate a servant. It breaks every tradition of Highmont." "I am the tradition." Gareth snarled, his amber eyes flashing gold in the firelight. He drew his broadsword. The shk of the steel clearing the leather scabbard made the lords flinch backward. Gareth didn't point the blade at Harford. He drove the tip of the heavy sword straight down into the frozen cobblestones, embedding it inches deep into the earth. He leaned on the pommel, staring down the insurrection. "I am taking my mate," Gareth declared, the finality in his tone echoing like a gavel strike. "She will not wear a crown of gold because this kingdom was built on iron. She is your queen. Anyone who refuses to bow to her can challenge me for the throne right here, right now, in the dirt." Gareth took his hand off the sword and crossed his arms over his chest. He waited. The tension was a physical pressure. The lords looked at each other. They looked at the massive sword buried in the stone. They looked at the Alpha King, who looked entirely ready, even eager to slaughter them all. No one moved. Slowly, agonizingly, Lord Harford lowered his eyes. He dropped to one knee in the slush. One by one, the other lords followed. The elite guards knelt. Beta Thomas knelt. Within a minute, the entire courtyard was bowing to a man wrapped in battle leathers and a woman wearing a stained grey dress. Gareth didn't smile. He looked down at Nora. "They hate me," Nora whispered, keeping her eyes straight ahead, watching the bowed heads of the men who had ignored her existence for a decade. "They fear you." Gareth corrected softly, his voice meant only for her. "And tomorrow they will fear you more because I am going to teach you how to ruin them." Nora finally looked up at him. The cynical, tired mask she had worn her entire life cracked. She let out a small, huffing laugh. It wasn't flowery, it wasn't poetic, it was real. Gareth reached up his rough fingers, brushing a stray lock of mousy brown hair behind her ear. He leaned down, ignoring the kneeling court, ignoring the cold, and pressed his forehead against hers. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. There would be time for softness later, behind closed doors, away from the politics and the blood. For now, in the freezing wind of the courtyard, he just breathed her in. Lye soap, damp wool, crushed rosemary. Gareth closed his eyes. For the first time in 10 years, the howling in his chest was quiet. The floorboards of his soul were rotten, yes. But they finally had someone willing to help him mend the wood. If you felt the chill of that winter wind and the absolute power of King Gareth driving his sword into the frozen earth, you know this wasn't your average fairy tale. Nora didn't need a glass slipper. She just needed the courage to look a monster in the eye and anchor him to reality. If you loved this gritty, slow-burn werewolf romance, hit that like button, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another intense, deeply human story from our channel. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a fiercely loyal alpha and an underestimated omega who bows to no one. Let us know in the comments, would you have stepped out into that courtyard? See you in the next tale.